Hey everyone! Before the year even finished counting down, before fireworks touched the sky or champagne kissed the glass, a decision had already been made about who she was allowed to be in other people's lives. And today's story is about what happens when a woman is quietly dismissed, publicly underestimated, and privately preparing a future that will shake every room she walks into. If you believe in stories where dignity outlasts disrespect, where silence becomes strategy, and where truth arrives right on time, then take a second, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and welcome to Black Queen Dominion. She entered the final weeks of the year carrying more than anyone realized. Not bags, not expectations, but history. Years of showing up early, staying late, softening her voice, shrinking her brilliance so others could feel comfortable. She had been taught that patience was power, that loyalty would be rewarded, that love was proven by endurance. She believed that if she held herself with grace long enough, the world would eventually recognize her worth. Instead, she was labeled. The words didn't come with shouting or drama. They were delivered calmly, almost clinically, wrapped in concern and framed as honesty. She was told she wasn't wife material. Not for the new year. Not for the future being planned without her. It wasn't just one man's opinion. It carried the weight of his family, their traditions, their unspoken hierarchies. A verdict passed down as if it were a favor, as if she should be grateful for the clarity. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't have to. Disrespect doesn't always scream. Sometimes it smiles politely and waits for you to accept less. She listened. She nodded. She didn't argue or plead. She didn't ask for explanations she already understood. She had learned long ago that some people don't want truth, they want compliance. And she refused to give them that. What they didn't know was that silence wasn't surrender. It was calculation. As the holidays crept closer, she withdrew, not dramatically but deliberately. Fewer visits. Shorter responses. Polite distance. They mistook it for sadness, for defeat, for a woman licking her wounds. They believed the story they told themselves, that she had reached her limit, that she would fade quietly into the background, another almost wife who didn't quite make the cut. They never asked where she was going. Behind closed doors, her life was shifting. Not emotionally, strategically. While they debated guest lists and New Year's plans, she was closing chapters. Finalizing documents. Making decisions that had nothing to do with them and everything to do with her future. She wasn't reacting to rejection. She was responding to revelation. Because being told you're not wife material does something powerful when you finally hear it clearly. It strips away illusion. It exposes intention. It frees you from trying to be chosen by people who never planned to choose you fairly. She stopped explaining herself. She stopped adjusting her tone. She stopped asking permission to exist fully. The woman they underestimated was no longer negotiating her value. The final days of the year passed with performative politeness. Holiday messages were exchanged. Smiles were worn like masks. They believed she was still hoping for reconsideration, still waiting for a miracle apology before midnight. They assumed time was on their side. They were wrong. The new year arrived quietly for her. No countdown parties. No dramatic declarations. Just clarity. Just resolve. Just a woman standing firmly in her own truth as the calendar changed. What made her dangerous wasn't anger. It wasn't bitterness. It was preparedness. She had spent years building a reputation that didn't rely on them. Years cultivating skills, relationships, credibility. While they evaluated her worth through outdated standards and narrow expectations, the world beyond them had already recognized her excellence. And now the timing was perfect. January 1st wasn't just a new date. It was a reveal. A moment when everything they thought they knew would be challenged without a single word spoken. She didn't plan revenge in the way they expected. There would be no confrontations, no emotional scenes, no desperate explanations. Her success would speak. Her status would confirm. Her legacy would correct the record. They would learn the truth not through arguments but through evidence. Not through apology but through exposure. And it would happen in the one place they believed she would never belong again. The family that dismissed her thought the story had ended before the year did. They thought she would disappear into quiet disappointment. Instead, she was about to arrive exactly where they least expected her. Unchanged in dignity, elevated in position, and impossible to ignore. As the sun rose on the first day of the year, she stepped into a future that had nothing to do with proving them wrong and everything to do with honoring herself. The silence she carried was no longer heavy. It was powerful. And day one was just beginning. The first day of the year carried a crispness, a subtle clarity in the air that felt like the world had been holding its breath, waiting for something to shift. For her, it was not just a day, it was a declaration. She moved through the city streets with a quiet confidence that disguised the storm of preparation beneath her calm exterior. Every choice she had made, every sacrifice endured, every silent moment of planning, it all converged into this singular arrival. She didn't enter like someone seeking validation. She entered like someone whose existence was undeniable. The house she stepped into, the house they had assumed would always exclude her, was no longer a symbol of denial. It was a stage. She had carefully orchestrated her presence in a way that would make the family recognize her power without her ever raising her voice. Her entrance was elegant, calculated, deliberate. There was no fanfare, no dramatic moment of confrontation. Just the quiet certainty of someone who had mastered patience and timing. It was an arrival that demanded acknowledgement whether they liked it or not. The room itself seemed to adjust to her presence. She noticed the subtle shifts. Heads turning, pauses in conversation, unspoken reassessments. People rarely understood the force of a woman who had built herself in silence. They had underestimated her because they had only ever seen what she allowed them to see: polite manners, restrained ambition, a readiness to comply with their narrative. But today every assumption would be dismantled. She had prepared meticulously for this day, and it showed in every detail of her appearance, every action, every subtle command of space. Her posture conveyed authority without arrogance. Her gaze held attention without intimidation. Even without words, she told a story of self-possession and achievement. And it was in that story that the first cracks began to appear in the carefully constructed facade of the family's judgment. They had planned to welcome a familiar face, someone they thought still fit into the narrative of their choosing. Instead, they were confronted with someone who had rewritten the script entirely. It was not just her presence that unsettled them. It was the aura of self-respect, of quiet accomplishment, of a woman who understood her worth without needing to be validated by others. They had judged her with condescension, labeled her with outdated standards, and assumed that time would erode her confidence. Now all those assumptions collided with reality. Every detail of her plan was deliberate. Documents of achievement, introductions to influential figures, subtle displays of recognition from people who mattered in ways they hadn't imagined. She didn't boast or brag. She merely positioned herself in spaces where her success spoke for her. And as the family observed, their certainty wavered. The whispers began, not directly to her but around her, in tones that betrayed confusion, and the faintest hint of respect mingled with disbelief. They were learning slowly that their assessment of her had been not only wrong but tragically incomplete. Her former partner, the man who had doubted her ability to be wife material, was present. His expression was carefully neutral, but every flicker of recognition betrayed him. He saw her, not just the exterior, but the embodiment of the years she had invested in herself, the quiet accumulation of skill, influence, and authority. The power she wielded was not loud or ostentatious, but it was palpable, a subtle yet undeniable force that reminded him of what he had dismissed. And the family watched his reaction, unable to shield him from the truth she radiated effortlessly. She navigated the day with precision. She interacted with warmth and grace, never showing that she was aware of every calculation, every judgment, every prior dismissal. She allowed her success to speak in measured, undeniable moments. A compliment received from a respected figure, a subtle nod of approval from someone whose opinion carried weight, a gesture that signaled her authority without the need for confrontation. It was a masterclass in controlled power, in using presence as influence, in demonstrating value without uttering a single defensive word. By midday, the atmosphere had shifted. The family that had once evaluated her with narrow, dismissive eyes now regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Their assumptions were unraveling, their previous certainty dissolving under the quiet weight of her accomplishments. They began to see the woman they had misjudged, the woman whose potential they had underestimated, and the realization was both uncomfortable and unavoidable. Every smile she offered was calm and poised, every gesture deliberate, yet it was enough to redefine their perception. The first subtle acknowledgement came in small gestures. A pause, a glance, a reassessment of seating arrangements. They had tried to control the narrative for years, to define her place and limit her influence. But now the narrative had shifted. She was no longer defined by their opinions or their standards. She had arrived on her own terms, bringing with her a presence that demanded recognition without asking for it. And every passing hour of that day reinforced it. Her former partner was forced to confront the contrast between his expectations and reality. He had imagined that dismissing her, belittling her potential, and questioning her worth would yield a predictable outcome. He had assumed that she would fade quietly, that the calendar flipping would not affect her trajectory. But now he was confronted with a living contradiction. A woman who had built a life, reputation, and authority that rendered his previous judgments meaningless. The power of her presence was undeniable, a quiet yet profound testament to the years he had overlooked. As the sun began to lower, signaling the approach of evening, the family's perception continued to shift. Their prior assumptions clashed violently with what they observed. They had expected compliance and mediocrity. They were faced with excellence and composure. They had assumed that they had the power to define her narrative. She demonstrated that the only narrative that mattered was the one she had written for herself. Every subtle recognition she received, every nod of respect from influential figures, every glance of acknowledgement, it all reinforced a single truth. She had arrived, fully prepared and irrevocably transformed. By the end of the day, the impact was clear. The family that had doubted her had begun to adjust, though uneasily. The man who had rejected her now understood the magnitude of what he had dismissed, though pride and shock prevented immediate acknowledgement. She, however, remained composed, her silence and poise speaking louder than any apology or confrontation ever could. She had proven without a word that the past judgments were irrelevant, that her value was inherent, and that her future would not be dictated by those who once tried to define it. And as the evening closed, she prepared for the next steps, not for revenge but for continuation, for building a legacy that could never be questioned, for moving through life with the assurance of someone who had always known her worth but had chosen the perfect moment to reveal it. The day had been won not with confrontation but with presence, not with argument but with undeniable evidence. The first day of the year had been her stage and she had claimed it flawlessly. The days following her calculated arrival were a quiet storm in motion. The first day had been about presence, about letting the truth settle in the minds of those who had misjudged her. Now the ripple effects began to spread, touching every corner of the family's world. She moved deliberately, understanding that influence was rarely instantaneous. It was a careful placement of decisions, subtle displays of competence, and a silent assertion of authority that left no room for doubt. She had learned long ago that power does not need to shout. It asserts itself through consistency, precision, and an unshakable sense of self. Every interaction she had was a message in disguise. She extended civility, warmth, and composure while quietly exposing the gaps in their assumptions. When conversations arose about the family's plans, finances, or upcoming social obligations, she contributed effortlessly, demonstrating knowledge, insight, and foresight that no one had expected. Every well-timed suggestion, every nuanced observation, served as proof that her potential had never been in question. Only their understanding of it had been flawed. Her former partner watched silently, a mixture of incredulity and unease simmering beneath a composed exterior. He realized, painfully, that the woman he had dismissed was now a force he could neither control nor ignore. His doubts had been replaced by the unavoidable truth. She had cultivated herself into someone indispensable, someone whose decisions could influence outcomes they had all assumed were safe from her reach. Pride, ego, and habit prevented him from conceding openly, but the subtle shifts in his behavior betrayed him. Every glance she caught held his awareness. Every calculated word of hers drew attention to the disparity between his expectations and reality. The family too felt the tension of the shift. They had underestimated her, and the consequences were unfolding in real time. Invitations were reconsidered in hushed conversations, previously firm stances wavered, and subtle attempts to reclaim control were met with the quiet authority of someone who had already anticipated resistance. They were learning gradually that power is not always visible, that authority does not always demand drama, and that some truths are unstoppable once fully realized. Behind her calm exterior, she was orchestrating her legacy. Documents were finalized, accounts were reviewed, plans for new ventures solidified. Everything was happening with an air of inevitability. The moves she had made over the past months, the relationships nurtured quietly, the opportunities cultivated without fanfare. They converged now, creating a network of influence that left no room for doubt. Her rise was not a spectacle. It was a demonstration of calculated mastery, the kind that leaves observers simultaneously awed and unsettled. Her former partner struggled with the contrast between what he thought he knew and what reality demanded. He had imagined that dismissing her would yield predictability, that the calendar turning would have no consequence on her trajectory. Instead, he faced a woman whose accomplishments and authority rendered his judgments irrelevant. The realization was quiet but undeniable. He had underestimated the scope of her power. And while he grappled with his own miscalculation, the family watched with mixed reactions: admiration, confusion, and the uneasy awareness that they had misjudged her entirely. By midweek, the dynamics of influence were undeniable. Her input carried weight, her presence commanded attention, and her decisions subtly reshaped the family's expectations. She did not confront them with hostility or recrimination. She simply embodied excellence and consistency, allowing her track record to speak louder than any argument or plea could. Authority she demonstrated does not require permission. It requires self-possession, and she possessed it in full. Opportunities arose where she had previously been dismissed. Business proposals, philanthropic endeavors, social engagements, all spaces she had been excluded from were now open, either by circumstance or her quiet maneuvering. She had cultivated relationships outside the family, but the family could not ignore her influence. They had assumed their power would constrain her reach, but her reach extended quietly, intelligently, and inexorably. And every subtle win, every acknowledgement of her competence, reinforced the undeniable truth. She was not only wife material in a personal sense but indispensable in every practical sense. Her former partner's attempts at reclaiming influence were weak, subtle, and ultimately ineffective. She anticipated them effortlessly, not through confrontation but through understanding, preparation, and timing. The authority she wielded was invisible yet tangible. It was present in the way she moved through conversations, the way her suggestions shaped decisions, the way her calm composure drew respect. She did not need to assert dominance. Dominance was simply the natural result of her preparation and capability. By the end of the week, the family's perception had shifted dramatically. They had begun to acknowledge her expertise, her insight, and the value she brought, not because she demanded recognition, but because the truth of her abilities could not be ignored. They had tried to define her through their narrow lens, but her reality was broader, more capable, and far more influential than they had ever imagined. Every subtle recognition they offered, every concession made in hushed acknowledgement, served as confirmation that their judgment had been flawed. The quiet tension between acknowledgement and pride was palpable. Her former partner faced the consequences of his underestimation. The family wrestled with the new hierarchy she had quietly established, and she continued to move with grace and strategy, never allowing emotions to cloud judgment or distract from the long-term vision she had set in motion. She understood the power of patience, the importance of timing, and the inevitability of results when preparation meets opportunity. As the first week of the year closed, her position was undeniable. The family who had once dismissed her now recalibrated their understanding of her. Her former partner, who had declared her unworthy, was forced to witness the truth of her success, influence, and composure. She did not need to argue or prove herself. The evidence of her worth was everywhere in the subtle shifts, the silent acknowledgments, the recalibrated expectations. And yet she knew the most profound changes were still to come. The first week had established presence and influence, but the deeper reckoning, the kind that would leave lasting impressions on their understanding of her power, was just beginning. She had built a foundation of undeniable authority, and the days ahead would reveal just how complete the transformation truly was. She had arrived as the underestimated, the dismissed, the overlooked. By the week's end, she was becoming the unavoidable, the undeniable, the inescapable truth that would redefine every space she entered. The quiet storm she had nurtured was now gaining momentum, and there was no force left that could redirect it. The momentum she had cultivated in the first week of the year began to crystallize into something undeniable. Her presence was no longer a subtle influence. It had transformed into authority that could not be ignored. Every decision she made, every calculated move, carried the weight of someone who understood both timing and impact. The family that had once dismissed her still breathed in disbelief, grappling with the quiet but unmistakable fact that the woman they had underestimated now wielded influence in spaces they had assumed were theirs alone. Her former partner tried subtly to assert control. He leaned on old expectations, outdated assumptions, and the sense of entitlement that comes with underestimating someone for far too long. But she anticipated every move not with anger but with strategy. She had built a network of relationships outside the walls of their judgment, allies who recognized talent and vision when they saw it. And quietly, with every meeting, every decision, she extended her reach further, leaving him unable to regain the control he once thought so absolute. The family began to feel the pressure of her presence. They had always measured worth through their own narrow lenses, defining success in terms of their comfort and tradition. But she operated in a broader reality, one defined by achievement, vision, and influence. They observed the subtle changes. Invitations being reconsidered, plans being subtly redirected, conversations bending toward her insight, and respect being given where it had previously been denied. They realized, reluctantly, that the foundation of authority they had built in their world could no longer contain her. Her strategy was simple yet devastatingly effective. She did not rely on conflict or dramatics to assert dominance. Instead, she allowed competence to speak louder than emotion. Her every action was a testament to preparation, foresight, and intelligence. She executed with precision, ensuring that every move reinforced her reputation as someone whose abilities could not be questioned. Subtle gestures, measured decisions, and the quiet accumulation of acknowledgement became her instruments of influence, shaping outcomes before anyone could resist. Her former partner, confronted with the consequences of his misjudgment, began to feel the weight of regret. The realization of underestimating her was painful, though never spoken aloud. Every glance, every interaction, reminded him of the scale of her transformation. Where he had once dismissed her as insufficient, she now embodied a force that could neither be challenged nor ignored. His previous certainty was replaced with an uneasy awareness of his miscalculation, and the family could not shield him from it. She moved with calculated grace through the spaces that had once excluded her. Social gatherings, business decisions, family councils, each became arenas where her influence was both subtle and profound. She never sought to humiliate or belittle. Instead, she allowed her competence to illuminate the gaps in perception, exposing the disparity between who she was and who they thought she could be. And every acknowledgement she received, every quiet nod of respect, served as confirmation that their judgment had been flawed from the beginning. The subtle dominance she wielded began to reshape relationships. Allies who had once been sidelined or ignored now recognized her vision and authority. Her network, built quietly and strategically, extended far beyond the family's assumptions. She leveraged this influence not through force, but through presence, integrity, and unassailable competence. It was a slow, deliberate dismantling of old hierarchies, executed with precision and without drama. Her former partner, watching this transformation unfold, began to understand the full scale of what he had lost. He had believed that labeling her as not wife material and dismissing her would secure predictability and control. Instead, he witnessed a woman whose authority was undeniable, whose presence redefined space, and whose achievements rendered prior judgments irrelevant. And while pride kept him from admitting his error, every action he observed reinforced the truth he could not deny. The family's response was a mixture of disbelief, unease, and gradual acknowledgement. They had underestimated her, and the consequences were becoming unavoidable. Their attempts to reassert influence were subtle and cautious, but every move was anticipated, every maneuver countered by the quiet mastery she had cultivated. Authority had shifted not through confrontation, but through undeniable competence and strategic placement. Her dominion expanded further when key figures recognized her value independently of the family's perception. Allies outside the household began to support her initiatives, providing validation that the family could neither control nor dismiss. Her reach became increasingly evident, and the family began to realize that their previous assumptions had been limited, small-minded, and dangerously short-sighted. By the end of the second week, the transformation was complete in its initial phase. The woman who had been dismissed, underestimated, and labeled as insufficient now commanded spaces that had once excluded her. Influence, recognition, and respect flowed naturally to her, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it through foresight, preparation, and execution. Her former partner and the family had no choice but to witness her rise, and every subtle acknowledgement reinforced the reality they had once denied. In the shadows of her composed presence, a deeper reckoning was forming. The day-to-day influence she wielded was undeniable, but the true power of her strategy would soon manifest in ways that left no room for doubt. She had not arrived to simply prove them wrong. She had arrived to establish a reality in which their judgments and dismissals were irrelevant, replaced by her undeniable authority, vision, and legacy. As the month progressed, the family began to reconcile with the truth of her dominion. They had assumed the calendar would reset their assumptions, that the new year could erase the consequences of their underestimation. Instead, they faced a woman whose accomplishments, composure, and strategy had rewritten the narrative. She moved like a force of nature, unchallenged in her purpose and deliberate in her influence. Every day, every interaction reinforced the power shift. Her former partner and the family could only observe, subtly adjust, and realize that the rules had changed. The woman they had dismissed had risen above the limitations imposed upon her. Her dominion was not loud or dramatic. It was precise, calculated, and inevitable. And with each passing day, the evidence of her transformation became clearer, leaving no space for denial, no room for argument, and no question that the new reality belonged to her. The final chapter of her rise unfolded like the inevitable turning of a tide. The family that had once judged her, dismissed her, and labeled her unworthy now found themselves confronted not with anger or confrontation, but with undeniable success. She had arrived not as a plea for acceptance, not as a figure seeking validation, but as a force whose accomplishments, authority, and vision could no longer be ignored. Every space she entered, every decision she influenced, left a lasting imprint that changed perceptions, dynamics, and power structures permanently. Her former partner had learned, in ways that were subtle but indelible, that underestimating a woman with patience, intellect, and strategy was not a simple miscalculation. It was a profound error. He watched quietly as she moved with the calm confidence of someone who had not only prepared for the moment of reckoning but had anticipated every possible obstacle. The very qualities he had once dismissed, discipline, foresight, composure, now became the instruments of a transformation he could neither control nor reverse. The family felt it most acutely when the implications of her influence became impossible to ignore. Invitations they had assumed would remain in their control were now subtly guided by her insight. Decisions about property, finances, and public affairs were naturally influenced by her presence, her foresight, and her judgment. They had thought of her as peripheral, someone whose role could be minimized. Now they realized that she had become central not by demand but by undeniable authority. Her power was not an exhibition of dominance. It was a demonstration of inevitability. She never forced recognition. Instead, she allowed the cumulative effect of her competence, preparation, and presence to speak louder than any argument ever could. Every nod of acknowledgement from influential figures, every quiet alignment with her vision, every small concession made in her presence reinforced the truth. She had always been more than they had imagined, and the world now saw what they had refused to recognize. The subtlety of her dominion was matched by its totality. She moved through every sphere with intention, connecting influence, recognition, and opportunity in ways that left no room for their denial. Her former partner, who had once reduced her worth to a dismissive label, now faced the reality of her success at every turn. Pride and shock collided within him as he watched her shape outcomes that had once been firmly beyond her reach. Every glance he cast her way betrayed the truth he could not speak aloud. He had misjudged the magnitude of her power. The family, too, could not escape the consequences of their assumptions. Their judgment, once narrow and certain, was dismantled by the undeniable evidence of her influence. They had measured her against outdated standards, evaluated her potential through a lens of limitation, and dismissed the force of her vision. Now they were forced to recognize that the woman they had undervalued had rewritten the rules, redefined the space, and commanded respect without seeking permission. Her strategy, executed flawlessly over days and weeks, culminated in recognition that transcended personal vindication. Her influence reshaped decisions, established authority, and secured a legacy that could not be contested. The subtle realignment of power, accomplished without confrontation, left the family in awe, unsettled, and ultimately aware that the calendar turning was no longer a tool of limitation but a marker of her triumph. The first day of the year had been her stage. The ensuing weeks had been her rehearsal, preparation, and demonstration of mastery. Now the final act revealed the full scope of her ascent. Where they had imagined limitation, there was influence. Where they had seen dependency, there was independence. Where they had assumed absence, there was inevitability. She had not merely reclaimed a place. They had been forced to recognize that she had never truly needed their approval to define her worth. Her former partner and the family had no choice but to witness the culmination of what they had underestimated. Their attempts to contain her, to direct her, to define her limits had been irrelevant. Her strategy, patience, and execution had rendered their assumptions obsolete. Authority and recognition had shifted quietly, irrevocably, and completely. She had arrived not for retribution but for reclamation, and the final outcome was indisputable. She had secured her legacy. And then, with the quiet confidence that had defined every move, she allowed the final acknowledgement to settle. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public declaration. Just presence, composure, and the weight of achievement. Her former partner recognized without words that he had been wrong. The family realized that their judgment had been flawed. And in the spaces they had tried to limit her, she had become indispensable. The truth of her rise was evident in every decision influenced, every plan guided, every nod of acknowledgement she received. Her legacy was not just personal triumph. It was proof that a woman underestimated can achieve far beyond the vision others impose on her. She had transformed perception, reshaped influence, and established a position that no one could challenge. By the end of the first month of the year, the story had shifted entirely. The woman who had been dismissed was no longer peripheral. She was central. She was dominant. She was unassailable in her authority and influence. And while the calendar had merely turned, the transformation she had enacted ensured that the world, and the family that once judged her, would never see her in the same way again. Her legacy was secure, her influence undeniable, and her place at the center of her own narrative permanent. The woman they had told was not wife material, had risen to claim far more than approval or validation. She had claimed power, respect, and legacy, the true markers of dominion. And in that quiet, unshakable victory, the year had begun not with a countdown, but with the irreversible recognition of her worth. The story of underestimation, silence, and strategic ascent concluded with clarity. She had turned every doubt into evidence, every insult into momentum, and every dismissal into a stepping stone. By day one and beyond, she had proven a truth the family could never contest. When a queen rises, her dominion is inevitable, undeniable, and everlasting.